Welcome back. In this segment, we will look at the environment and how organisms on the planet are adapted to the varying conditions in the environment. This will lead into the next segment, which will dig into that a little bit further, where you're actually looking at adaptations to variations in the environment by the same organism. In other words, there's always a gradient of heat, shall we say. And how do you have the capacity to deal with from hot to cold? That would be from midday to late night, say in a desert. And so these are all things that organisms face. These are pressures from the environment, and they have adaptations. So we're going to look at that for the next couple of segments. And from there we're going to get into some, eventually we're heading towards, this is all sort of background, okay? And the first several chapters in your book, I'm expecting, when I say background, I'm not only am I sort of building a foundation for you in this class, but I have an expectation that a lot of this is probably not new, okay? However, you have to sort of internalize it here, because it's building this foundation as we head into the more interesting ecological issues like population studies, population ecology, community ecology, ecosystems. All of this plays a role, all of the material we'll be talking about, the adaptations, play a role in how these organisms and structures of the hierarchy, that is, you know, the old way, cells up to environment to the planet, how we have come to the place we're at, where everything is seemingly adapted but constantly changing, as it turns out, because you never get perfect. Your adaptations are never locked in, or you're doomed in some ways in an evolutionary sense. Okay, I'm riffing a bit here, so let's move on. I'm going to reinforce a little bit from lecture 1. Make sure you go into the textbook. Again, this is the economy of nature, and at the end, there are learning objectives. And those, you know, you always have to pay attention to what the professor, me, has emphasized. And so you want to look in particular in your text at sections 1.3 and 1.4. Those are the ones that I really dug into, the areas that I really dug into for these lectures. And go into the critical thinking questions on the same page. This is page 29 in your text. And there you can actually really get engaged. They're asking you these questions. They may seem really out there, and they're not providing you answers, although they're in the text. And you might hear some information in my lectures that help you. But the notion here that I really want, it's not just reading these things, but it's engaging. It's getting your mind thinking and analyzing, and that's super powerful, super powerful. And your book does a really good job with these kinds of activities to help you internalize again these concepts. The book, you'll find, is very well written. I hope you find that's true. That has one problem. You'd be sitting there, let's say, chilling out on your sofa, reading the section. It is making all kinds of sense. And you have to read that same paragraph 3 or 4 times, because you're just like, yeah, and it's not sinking in. Not because it's difficult, but because it's too well written, I find sometimes. I mean, a lot of times I read a little bit before I come into my lectures to make sure I've got everything as locked in as possible. And I think, gosh, this is so well written, but I bet it's easy to kind of get lost just because you're not paying attention. You're not getting the stimulus because it's not too difficult, paragraph by paragraph. So best to do as much as you can to engage yourself as you're reading. Okay, that's just a quick wording. Now, also on page 22, there's a section called Analyzing Ecology. And those are some sort of problem sets. And again, you could look through all of those and figure out what is applicable to what I've been talking about. But in particular, number 10 is about statistics. And it refers back to a little box several pages earlier that actually goes through an example of calculating means and variations, and even, I think, even a t-test, if I'm not mistaken. You'd think I would have that down because I was only looking at it yesterday. But anyway, do number 10, and we will cover it. Probably it'll be covered with an open discussion in a chat room or something with your TAs to make sure that it all makes sense to you. And work through that example, and that'll help you as you get into your lab exercises where you have to calculate t-tests and interpret the data and all that. So everything I talked about last time is covered in that number 10, critical thinking questions. And so do that. It can only help, okay? Okay, very good. So today, we're looking, as I said, at adaptations to the environment. And this is a really crazy, buckle your seatbelt kind of overview of 6 different chapters. And again, as I've already mentioned today, they are general chapters that probably serve as review in part or whole for most of you. And I am only highlighting the peaks of the information. I'm not covering the entire section, chapters 1 through 6. I'm just getting highlights that I think are particularly important. So it would behoove you to think of my lectures as a guidance to you when it's time to do a test and study. You look, my gosh, there's 6 chapters. Okay, no, 5. I skipped 4. So you don't have to look at 4. Within each chapter, you don't have to look at everything. You just look at the parts that I highlighted. And you'll have a guidance on that in these lectures because there's going to be information and all of the figures that I think are particularly important. I put the number of the figure next to the figure so that you can go to the textbook and pull that up, read the figure, legend, and go into the text associated with that figure and read all the information around it, including probably what led to the author getting to that point and where he goes afterwards, because that kind of builds up the information. Here's a case study, and then what does it do for the rest of ecology from there? So be sure you do that and realize that this is a lot of information. If you were to just read the text, it might be daunting, but we'll just be highlighting critical things. This figure, this slide I just kind of put together some images to give you a sense that the environment is not necessarily benign. So that little cocopod on the left, I think it's a cocopod, not my wheelhouse, but it's a small little, very small little organism that does a heck of a lot. We'll look at a little bit of its metabolism later in the lecture. And it's the picture of the waves there, it's living in tide pools, which can get pretty hot, right? After the tide goes out, after the lunar changes occur, the tide might not come back up to where it lives for a week. And so every day the sun is blasting down and making it really hot, and the water gets warm. And that's a problem. But the bigger problem is that all the fresh water is evaporating. And therefore, actually what it has to do is figure out how to deal with the saline environment going way up. Gets incredibly salty. And then a big wave comes in when the high tide comes, and within one day, or maybe one wave, right back to the old conditions. And can you, if you have a little bit of science background, can you imagine the osmotic issues that come with very slowly ramping up the concentration of salt in your environment, and then in one wave go right back to what it was? And this guy isn't exactly impermeable to water. So as the concentrations change, its solutes are changing, or better, or it's going to die. So we'll come back to that. We'll look at it. It's a pretty fascinating topic to me. Of course, that whale is jumping out. I just use that as a fun example of the fact that the whale doesn't belong in the air. Does it? It belongs in the water. So whatever it's doing, it doesn't plan to stick around up there. Still has to have a way to deal with getting out of the water, even briefly, or it'll dry out. Its skin is probably permeable too. Over there on the right, my favorite topic, the mushroom, is coming out of a asphalt patch. I used to see this, so I grew up in Los Angeles, and I used to skateboard on brand new asphalt because it was so smooth, right? And get out of the issues where there might be rocks or something like that. And I would find mushrooms coming out of the asphalt. Now, it was really hot in Los Angeles. The temperatures would get easily up to 90 degrees in the summer and sometimes past 100 Fahrenheit. And I'd find these mushrooms popping up, and how the heck are they punching up through the asphalt, which is kind of soft when it gets hot like that. But B, that mushroom, if you step on it, it's smashed, right? You know how mushrooms are. You just put it between your hands, smashed. So how do they, we're not going to get into this, I'm not going to go there, but just as a visual, this organism is dealing with its environment in a very unique way and has figured out how to do it. It's kind of a cool thing. And lastly, there on the right is the Sahara cactus, and cacti are just the classic example of a plant that has to adapt to very xeric, that is dry conditions. No leaves, right? Adaptations to preventing water loss. I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the lecture. So all of these organisms I just use as visuals to let you think about how the environment is not necessarily benign, and we're not necessarily adapted to dealing with them. Organisms get close and are constantly trying to improve, if you will, but it's a constant battle. Should I say that? Constant tug of war. Okay. A couple more bits of eye candy to emphasize that, and let me just go ahead and riff on it. That guy on the right looks like he's in a heap of trouble. He's surfing down the face of that wave. Usually he would cut left over to here, but that's not exactly a good spot to be either. It would be great if he was back here in the tube and then come out and then get out. But that's a wall of water behind him, and boy, I hope he knows what he's doing. Look at back here. The wave has already been through this section. That's not exactly a good place to be either. That's called the washing machine area, and if that's what's going to happen here, he's going to be underwater, just rolling and tumbling, and hopefully holding his breath until things work out. Again, just to emphasize that wherever we are, we're probably out of our safe zone. Here's a guy climbing, I believe, El Capitan in Yosemite, and he knows what he's doing. He's got some ropes, but why do we do these things? It's exciting. X Games, right? Anyway, adaptations to the environment, and we're looking at both aquatic and terrestrial, even for humans. And then we're going to get into a little bit about elements beyond those specific sort of physical adaptations we have that you can see. We have some elements that are involved as well, and how physiologically we might go one way or another in our metabolism to get elements and to use elements in our systems. All right, so many inorganic nutrients dissolve and are dissolved in water. Water is incredibly powerful, and that's what makes this planet such a great place to be for life as we know it. You always have to add that in there. Maybe there's another place where water isn't so important and everything lives on liquid methane. Probably not, but okay. Why is water so important? It's polar. So you've got an oxygen molecule at one side, and then you've got two hydrogen molecules here, these little Mickey Mouse ears. The hydrogen molecules are protons, largely, plus charge. And then the oxygen has a negative charge. So this is polar. It's got two different charges, really, on that molecule. And so the negative end is attracted to the sodium, which is positive, and that basically makes salt dissolve in water very rapidly and stay dissolved. It doesn't form a precipitate back to salt crystals until it becomes super concentrated and overwhelms the water polarity, if you will. So that's huge on this planet, absolutely critical, and it's why we live as we do. Fresh water has a lot of calcium, calcium carbonate, or carbonic acid, HCO3 minus, and sulfate. And organisms in various ways are accessing those elements for their metabolism through the water or in their bodies too, so that the material moves around to get to where it needs to do its thing inside the body. Okay, salt water also has a lot of calcium, sodium now, and chlorine, a lot of salt in salt water. Also has magnesium sulfate. And most of these elements that give salt water its salty flavor is the result of constant runoff from the terrestrial environment, bringing that material into the saltwater basins. And they stay dissolved. And I mean, fresh water, just pure water, is not all that good for you. You could drink it a lot. It's important for you. But you need these minerals. Organisms need these minerals. So the salt water is actually a little bit better for you. You just can't drink it because you dehydrate. You do need the water. I should be careful with what I'm saying there. And the interesting thing potentially, is for here, the oceanic waters are saturated with calcium. That's going to become important down the road. And I'll just throw, the classic, why is that important today? It may have something to do with how the planet is dealing with climate change, okay? Or how it might be able to deal with climate change. CO2 may be interacting with the water and the calcium in the oceans that will help things down the road. In fact, have helped in past periods on this planet. I'll get into that much later in the semester. But anyway, it's an important fact that the calcium is saturated in oceanic waters. That helps because you can pull a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere because of that. Okay, I didn't talk about figure 2.7, but let me go ahead and give that a little run here. So notice that the water is also kind of surrounding that calcium negative ion, but now the water has flipped to the positive side where the two protons are. Okay, and it's not quite as strong, so you could see that the author is saying, well, it's probably only one of the atoms that is surrounding or causing this sort of interaction, this ionic interaction, bonding, if you will. Very loose, though. Heat it up and the stuff just goes flying off. Okay, around a chlorine ion, NaCl, salt. Okay, so here's for me, one of these iconic images, because I grew up in the 70s. This is back in the old days, like a long time ago. Dinosaurs had just died out, but we used to go out and buy record albums. They're like these vinyl things. And inside those big record album covers, they sometimes had little things to give people beyond the music that was on the record. The Pink Floyd Wish You Were Here album had all these pictures that were sort of just bizarre, as Pink Floyd is. And one of them was this, and I remember seeing it and thinking, wow, that is cool. Kind of like the guy doing his headstand in there. And I like those tufa towers in the background, what those are calcium carbonate. I've already sort of mentioned that. And this is north of Los Angeles. I told you I grew up in Los Angeles, right? So this is north of Los Angeles. The Sierra Nevada are over here. This is in the Owens Valley. It's a high desert. And when I was growing up, I had all kinds of water. Just turned on the tap, got water. That was coming out of tributaries that were feeding this lake, Mono Lake. And I would say in the 1900s, early 1900s, before I was born, the water level of the lake, I just got to where I wanted to there. Right here, that's where the water level was. These tufa towers don't come out of the water. They are forming under the water because there are springs under the water that have come through the Sierra Nevada, and they're bubbling up with tons of calcium. I suppose literally tons, but who knows? Lots of calcium. And it's interacting with the CO2 and forming these tufa towers that are essentially limestone, calcium carbonate. And as people like me and others moved to LA and they made orange groves and things like that, the water levels dropped because the LA folks, in the initial stages of carving it out and making subdivisions and orange groves and such, diverted all 3 tributaries into this Mono Lake. And so the water levels were going down, 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 down. And today it's a little higher because through lawsuits now 1 tributary does feed into it, and that seems to stabilize it. Anyway, one more little side note. I was so fascinated with this. I did a lot of backpacking in the Sierra Nevada and did a lot of work, or not work, but looking for rocks and things like that in the Owens Valley. It's a pretty fascinating area. And I would go by Mono Lake a lot. John Muir talks about it. He says he would dip his dirty clothes in Mono Lake and it would come out, this is a little bit, a sign of the times, his language, but he said it would come out cleaner than the ablest washerwoman would have made his clothes. It's very alkaline, and I thought, well, shoot, I should try that because my sneakers are getting a little old. Been out hiking around a lot. So I went in and I dipped my sneakers in, left them there for a few, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, had lunch, came back, pulled them out, rinsed them off, let them dry, wore them. And indeed, they were, well, kind of clean, but they were no longer odoriferous, but they totally fell apart. All the glue and everything just dissolved, so that within about a month, I had to go buy new shoes anyway because it had really had a number on them. I also, one time, I had somewhere, but this is in the day of pictures when you have slides instead of digital images. I had a friend take a picture of me doing that. I did a little headstand out there. You could float in there without any trouble with your arms and hands up. It's pretty thick with calcium carbonate. Okay, anyway. Let's move on. We're done, Horton. Move. Okay, if you ever get out there, there are hot springs in the area. It's worth a visit. All right, on to another idea with the water, and that is acidity and what? Basicity? So another major gradient that is in the aquatic system that organisms deal with is the hydrogen ions. And you know this as pH. Right? And what the pH is telling you is how many protons really are in, hydrogen is in that water. When there's an awful lot, 10 to the negative 1, it's very acidic. Okay? And when there isn't very much, 10 to the negative 14, that's a lot of zeros, 0.000000000, okay, it's very basic. Both are caustic, right? Bleach is not a healthy thing to drink. Sign of the times. But neither is stomach acid, right? You know acid is very caustic and will burn you. It turns out alkaline solutions will as well. Extremely reactive. They dissolve minerals, which releases those minerals into the water, and organisms can use them instead of being bound up with the rocks. Harmful for most life, but a lot of organisms have figured out how to live through that. There are organisms that can live at extremely high pHs, low pH, including in your stomach, right? As well as those that can live at these high pHs, 14, and in very alkaline conditions like Mono Lake. So anyway, couple more data points. Yeah, so those are the very acidic conditions, very harmful for most life, and these are the areas that are very harmful for most life as well. Note, yeah, your Coca-Cola, pretty acidic. Acid rain, a little less so. A couple other points. Human blood is pretty close to the oceans, and I was always told when I was a kid that it's no mistake that human blood is close to the ocean. In fact, most organisms have their systems at pH right around 7, neutral, which I always thought, okay, neutral, that makes sense. But actually, it probably more reflects the oceans where everything evolved out of, right? So we basically carry the ocean with us. Alkaline lake, there's Mono Lake right there. All right. Couple of elements we're going to highlight. I want to highlight a couple of important elements now. Carbon and oxygen are hugely important on this planet. We are carbon-based forms. If you watch enough Star Trek, you've heard that. they're intimately involved in energy transformations. And so you go from glucose, break it up, and you can get energy from that, and that's what we do. We respire, get that energy, feed it into ATP and such. But the plants are taking carbon dioxide and water and transforming that into, because they have a lot of light energy, they can go ahead and transform that into glucose, into sugar. They use it, but they have so much energy from the sun that they can make abundant amounts, and some more than others. And in fact, we can, force them down a pathway to make high fructose corn syrup, corn that's incredibly abundant with sugar. It's not the way corn was, how it evolved, right? But that's what we use now. Those big orange, those are definitely not ready for prime time in the real world, but we're using them. Anyway, and there's, as I said here, there's energy in them, there are chemical bonds. This is where I was going to have someone cue in a banjo solo by Earl Scruggs or somebody who was the Jimi Hendrix of banjo players. Beverly Hillbillies? Okay, 1970, never mind. Anyway, energy transformations are very important in metabolism. They involve oxidation and reduction. So when you get to that part in chemistry, stop and listen. There's something going on there that's very important, and we can make very good predictions about how the reaction will go based on what we know about oxidation and reduction. We're all doing this with carbon in aerobic conditions, but there are also other aerobic reactions that we humans don't use, but other organisms do, as well as anaerobic reactions that involve iron, sulfur, forms of nitrogen. So it's not all aerobic. And in fact, I think as I implied last time, the oxygen came late on this planet. Most transformations initially were anaerobic and really didn't involve at least the carbon version that we know, photosynthesis and such. And bacteria and archaea are the workhorses here. They are doing everything. I could just say bacteria to get the point across. The prokaryotes. We're not doing a whole lot. Organisms that utilize that energy that they've been able to work with and move up the food chain, we go ahead and use that energy that's been bound up in those chemical bonds, and then like glucose, and then break it open and release that energy for our life. But we really rely on those microbes to do to get to where we can use that energy. And I'll emphasize that a little bit more. Now, trophic, is the same root, refers to energy. Okay, there are autotrophs and heterotrophs. So autotroph, obviously, something that makes its own energy. I don't know if it's obvious, but that's what it is, auto. And then heterotroph is something that has to eat something else to get its energy. So I've got a picture there of my student eating a mushroom, or like at least acting like it, delicious Boletus edulis, which should be cooked. But we found it, and we were so excited because we were going to have a delicious dinner that night. She's an autotroph. The fungus is an autotroph. Next to her is a plant, actually two plants. There's a pine in the background. She's a heterotroph. Did I say autotroph? Awesome. Yeah, she's a heterotroph. She has to get her energy from something else. That pine is an autotroph. It gets its energy from the sun and makes its own sugar, etc., right? Photosynthesis. The thing in front is red. It's not a fungus. In fact, those are little red flowers all along that stem. It's related to blueberry in the Ericaceae, and it's a heterotroph. It's parasitic indirectly on that pine. It gets its energy from the pine through a fungal bridge, if you will. And I'm going to get into that in gory detail in a later lecture. But not all plants are autotrophs. Some are heterotrophs. And then, so here, autotrophs are getting their energy from inorganic sources. Chemoautotrophs, obtaining energy from chemical bonds that someone else fixed for us. Chemical bonds like the iron and the nitrogen. And there will be a lecture later on when we get to ecosystems that look at nutrient cycling, and we'll get into some of that then, but just to give you a sense of where we're headed. And then the photoautotrophs are things like plants and algae and things like that, getting energy from light. And then the heterotrophs, obtaining energy from consuming organic biological sources like that mushroom for Tara there. So one moment here, let me see where I am. Oh, excuse me, bear with me. Good. That's it for this segment. I will see you next time, and I will dig into this a little bit more, looking at the elements and which ones are important, and just touch on the surface of why. But again, all of these things I'm touching on the surface in these lectures, we will explore in more detail in later lectures when we get there. So that's it. We'll see you next time, and thanks a lot. Cheers.